Chinese-owned corner stores throughout Jamaica from the 1930s through to the 70s. Documentary filmmaker Jeanette grew up in a Chinese-owned shop in Kingston, Jamaica. In her new documentary, she details the complex relationship and social interaction between the Chinese shopkeepers and their Jamaican customers. Jeanette is with us tonight to tell us more about how the Chinese minority contributed to Jamaican society. Heading down to the Chinese shop. That's tonight on the agenda in the summer.
Funding for the agenda in the summer with Pia Chattopadhyay is provided by Ontario's 33,000 chartered accountants, public policy leaders since 1879. More information is available at icao.on.ca and by contributions to TVO by viewers like you. Thank you.
And joining us now in studio, Jeanette, director and producer of the documentary The Chinese Shop. Hello, welcome back to TVO.
Thanks.
On the other side of the table now.
Yes.
You just
being on camera.
We want to talk about your documentary, The Chinese Shop. We have to start off by me asking you, what is a Chinese shop?
A Chinese shop. Chinese, the patois word, the Jamaican dialect for Chinese. So basically, it's a Chinese shop.
Chinese, C-H-I-N-E-Y.
Chinese,
okay.
Yes.
Chinese.
And you have to kind of say it with a Jamaican lilt.
I'm not going to do that because I will sound
Okay.
ridiculous. But I have to say, when I saw the name of your documentary, Chinese Shop, I thought, you know, the word Chinese, I felt it sounded a little bit derogatory. Is this still a term that Jamaicans use to refer to the Chinese people on the island?
For sure, they still use it, and it's not derogatory. I know it sounds a little bit politically incorrect, but basically, it's like us saying, you know, instead of saying Canadian, we'll say Canuck.
Okay, so what is a Chinese shop?
A Chinese shop is a Chinese grocery store that sells far more than what you would find in a Canadian corner store. More things, and it's owned by a Chinese shopkeeper and his family.
So the Chinese people came to Jamaica in the 1930s was when the general influx was. Why did they come?
They came, well, the Chinese went to Jamaica in the 1850s as indentured laborers. So at the end of slavery, the British brought them in to work in the sugarcane plantations. So originally, indentured laborers came from China, and they worked the land, and then some of them stayed after their contracts ended and then bought businesses, and then they brought relatives over. So the Chinese shop kind of exploded all over the island of Jamaica in the 1930s and continued into the early 70s.
And as more and more family members came and more Chinese people came over, they seemed to sort of overtake the retail industry, the shop industry in Jamaica. How did they do that?
Well, they definitely dominated the industry, and they did that because they brought over their own relatives, you know. A lot of men came over who were cousins or nephews or uncles of the original people in Jamaica. And they dominated because they were from the same area in China. Okay, so in Guangdong province in southern China, they came from the same area, and they were the same distinct cultural group called the Hakka. So they kind of all knew each other, and they formed these associations, retail associations, wholesalers associations, and were able to just, you know, dominate the industry that way.
Your father owned one of these shops. Take me inside what you remember of when you were a child into your father's shop. What was it like inside?
Inside, it was a very small store, but you walked in and there was an open area, and then there was a counter. And so, and behind that counter, there were shelves full of all these different canned goods. And, you know, my parents sold patties and you know, loaves of bread, hardo bread. And so, you know, you'd serve customers over the counter. And I remember as a child, there was a stool, and I was very small when I was a child, a small child, and they put me on this stool, and when it wasn't busy, you know, I would help them to make change when customers would come in.
But it wasn't just a shop, right? It was more than that. I mean, sort of culturally, it was where people came to meet and hang out. It wasn't just like me going into the local 7-Eleven, paying for my goods and leaving, was it?
No, people came there, you know, they would buy, you know, goods in small amounts, like what, you know, they didn't have a lot of refrigeration, so people would come in daily, you know, to buy lunch. You know, they'd go in there to buy lunch and then come home, and before going home to make their dinners, they would buy small amounts to make dinner. And we had a woman, I remember her name, Miss Harvey, and she had a fruit and vegetable stand within my parents' that open area that I told you. She was in a corner, and Miss Harvey used to sell fruits and vegetables in there, so they could get their fruits and vegetables as well.
And your home was attached to the shop as well?
Yes, we lived in the back of the shop and upstairs, so we actually had a second floor. But you know, the really rich shopkeepers had their homes away from the shop, and so you could kind of tell who were richer because they lived in houses and they didn't live in their shop.
So the height of the Chinese shop in Jamaica is 30s through the 70s. Are they still around today? What's the status of them?
There's still Chinese shops, but you know, because of the political instability in Jamaica in the early 70s, between Michael Manley and Edward Seaga, there was a mass exodus of not only Jamaican Chinese, but a lot of Chinese or Jamaicans in general left Jamaica. So for a long time, the population of the Chinese sort of diminished to maybe 0.2% of the population.
From what?
From about maybe maybe about 0.7% of the population. Okay. So a lot of Chinese left, and then for a long time, the shops might have been run by other people, and then a second wave of Chinese immigration has happened in Jamaica. But it's not from the same area, they're sort of from all over China. So there's a second wave of Chinese immigrant to Jamaica.
And what's been the impact of that immigration and other things like globalization on the Chinese shop as we once knew it in Jamaica?
Well, Jamaica has developed like any other country, and so rather than sort of small shops, you will see large supermarket chains. So when I went back to Jamaica in 2006, I was quite amazed to see that they had supermarkets as large as Loblaws here, and you could buy everything, and it was quite upscale. So it was really kind of interesting to see that development.
Okay, so that's a little bit of the history of the Chinese shop. I want to talk about what you refer to as the Jamaican people and their relationship between the Chinese people. Now, everyone that we're really talking about is Jamaican, but we're delineating between Black Jamaican and Chinese Jamaicans for that, just to make the separation. But you're all Jamaicans when it comes down to it.
Oh, for sure. Out of many, one people.
Okay, that's the slogan.
Yes, the national motto of Jamaica.
Okay, what do you remember most about growing up as a Chinese girl in Jamaica when we look at the cultural differences between the groups?
Well, the Chinese in Jamaica, when I was growing up, we were very isolated, insular. We didn't mix with other Jamaicans. I went to school, and then, when I came home from school, I just stayed in my parents' shop. We didn't sort of go out and play. We played in our yard, in our backyard. And I can count on one hand, literally, the families that we would socialize with. And they were extended family, basically. So very isolated.
Why?
Why? I think because my parents my father was born in Jamaica, but he grew up in China and then returned to Jamaica. I think there was not wanting to lose their culture, wanting to kind of maintain their cultural values, their culture. It just was the way it was back then. Jamaican society is very stratified in many ways, and so 90% of the population is African Jamaican, Jamaican of African descent. But there are other groups. There are, white Jamaicans who are from Scotland, England, the Irish. There are German Jamaicans. There are Jewish Jamaicans. A lot of Indian Jamaicans from East Indians. So just they tended to stay. The Chinese tended to stay within their own cultural group.
You say that your father and other Chinese Jamaicans almost chose to isolate themselves to preserve their cultural values. What were their cultural values?
Well, they really believed in education. They believed in helping each other out, and just to work hard, basically.
And
Yeah.
that sort of separated them culturally from other Jamaicans.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of Jamaicans who are hard workers, that's for sure. It was interesting, I was reading this report on StatsCan about the Jamaican community in Canada, and it seems like the Jamaican community in Canada has a higher percentage of people who work, you know, than the average. So, but saying that, I just think that they just wanted to preserve their cultural values.
Did you grow up speaking what languages then in your house and with your family?
Well, grew up speaking, basically when I was very small, I spoke Hakka, which is the Chinese dialect that we spoke. And then, you know, it became, after I started going to school, it was a mixture.
Of English or patois?
Well, we learned English in school, but really at home we spoke patois and Chinese. So this kind of hybrid dialect that only, you know, myself and my family understood.
Okay. Your father obviously had a relationship running the shop with local Jamaican people. What was that relationship like?
I would say that my dad had a very good relationship with most of his customers. I mean, obviously, you know, there's always, you know, sometimes you can't have all wonderful customers, but for the most part. And I just remembered that it was a complex relationship in terms of, you know, he extended credit to some of his, you know, a lot of his customers. So there'd be a book where he would just, you know, write their names down and you know, if they wanted whatever they needed, he would write down, and then once a month or whatever, they would pay their account. But growing up, you know, for the most part, it was a very warm relationship.
So there was this trust between shop owner and customer in that we trust you that you'll pay us back the money that we're lending you right now.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And we're done without interest.
Okay. Yeah. Wish I could have a shop like that.
Exactly.
I want to play you a clip. This is of Malcolm Gladwell, the writer, talking about his mother, Joyce, who grew up in a rural part of Jamaica. Let's take a look at that.
Okay.
My mother grew up in very modest circumstances in the middle of Jamaica, and I try to explain how did she end up as a professional and upper middle class household in Southern Ontario. And I do so by going back over all of the lessons of the book and talking about how they applied to my mother. I mean, how much her success was a product of many different opportunities that were provided to her by others.
So Joyce Gladwell was one of your interview subjects in your documentary, and she talks about in the documentary how the local Chinese shop owner was part of her success. You heard her son there saying that her success was built on what other people helped her do. How so? How was Joyce's success built upon the Chinese shop?
In my conversations with her, when I first approached her to participate in my documentary, she was very, very open to that because, you know, she's a very thoughtful person. I mean, I'm not surprised that Malcolm is so brilliant because he comes from Joyce, and she's brilliant in her own right. And she talked about the sort of the model of the Chinese shopkeeper in her community, how they sort of modeled for her, you know, stability and hard work, and in those ways, she talked about their influence. And also, I guess in terms of, you know, in the film, this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but you know, her mother did borrow the money from a Chinese shopkeeper to allow her to go to school in England.
It wasn't an insubstantial amount of money either. It was thousands of dollars so she could go off and pursue her post-secondary education. We talked a little bit about, you know, your father having the book and letting locals, you know, you bought an orange, pay me back at the end of the month. But I'm wondering, has this very large-scale credit relationship between shop owner and the locals changed?
Today? Oh, I'm sure it has. I mean, I think, you know, times people have moved on, you know, people have credit cards in Jamaica. I mean, credit is like that everywhere, right? So yes, I mean, things have changed.
But you went back, I mean, several years ago, but when you were 16 at that time, had it changed already?
I don't recall if I knew that. I mean, my parents weren't, in their shop anymore, and we'd visited our shop, but by that time, an uncle had taken it over, so I'm not clear about that.
Is the shop still running today?
Yeah, when I went back in 2006, we did pass by the shop, but it wasn't open at the time, so I'm not sure if it is or not.
So that sort of sharing relationship, sharing of money and trust was a positive aspect of the relationship between Chinese Jamaicans and Jamaicans. What were some of the major cultural barriers between the two groups?
Well, there's a lot of stereotypes, and we find stereotypes everywhere, but in Jamaica, there's a lot of stereotypes of the Chinese cheating their customers, and shortchanging them, and that sort of thing. You can imagine, and the Chinese towards African Jamaicans. I guess it's the same. There's a lot of violence in Jamaica and a lot of crime. I mean, no one's denying that. The stats speak for themselves. It is a very violent society. So, although there are many upstanding citizens in Jamaica, there is a lot of crime. So, I guess the Chinese sort of felt like they had to protect themselves against that violence and crime.
I want to play another clip from your documentary. This is former Liberal MVP Alvin Curling talking about the dynamic between the shop owners and the locals.
They also played a very subliminal kind of role. They were quite disciplined, very quiet, looked very obedient. So one more or less emulate some of those behaviors from the Chinese quietly. Some would not admit it, but it was there because we find that they were not, they were very polite and quite disciplined.
Do you see it that way, that the two groups, if I can call them that, influenced one another and took the good from each other's cultures, if I can put it that way?
I think so. Definitely, you can put it that way. That's very on the mark, Pia. The second generation, the Chinese, the children of the shopkeepers, they very much integrated into Jamaican society and are very open, and they consider themselves very Jamaican.
Do we see it more nowadays, a mixing between the two groups, rather than the isolated atmosphere that you remember as a child?
For sure. There isn't those barriers. So, the period that I'm talking about is the 1930s to the 1970s, and obviously Jamaica has developed, and it's a very mixed society. There are a lot of intermarriages and a lot of beautiful children and beautiful products of these unions, so for sure.
Okay, I want to play one more clip from the documentary. This is, again, Joyce Gladwell, who we talked about a little earlier.
In Jamaica, the Chinese were a people apart, and I'm afraid they were also, by some people, they were despised. I have a theory. I have a theory that Jamaica was a very structured society, and there was also big fleas, lesser fleas, and everybody wanted to find somebody that they could put down and denigrate, because they experienced that themselves.
Okay, Jeanette, is Joyce's perspective a common one?
Definitely. As I mentioned, Jamaica's a very stratified society, and so the British, sort of ruled Jamaica, and there was an elite. I mean, very much like what we would find in Canada, that there's an establishment, and so in Jamaica there was an establishment, and so there might have been tensions, and frustrations that the common sort of poor Jamaican wanted to take out, and so there were some anti-Chinese riots that happened in Jamaica, in the period I would say pre-independence.
Well, in the 1930s, during the labor riots, many Chinese grocery stores were looted and robbed. Some cases, their owners were murdered. And you've started establishing in your documentary and in our conversation that there's this familial relationship between the Chinese shop owners and the Jamaican locals, but there must have been some ripple effects, negative ones, from the history of what had happened between the two groups. There weren't they not?
Oh, for sure. There are definitely tensions, but at the same time there were tensions. I mean, I didn't deal with a lot of that in my documentary because I really did want to address sort of the more familial, you know, sort of genteel relations between the two, because I think that tends to be ignored in mainstream media, and I think that it's really resonated. The film has really resonated with a lot of Jamaican Canadians, because they do remember the everyday interaction, you know, in the same way that, you know, we may not think about, you know, dealing with the person at our corner store. You know, we may have these interactions with them, but who are these people, you know, behind, you know, at the cash register?
You mentioned the Chinese Jamaican community here in Canada. How extensive is it?
I think there's about 20,000 people, as far as I know. I mean, that's from, I spoke to this woman who's in my documentary, Carol Wong, and Carol is, you know, she knows so much about the community here, and they're quite, I would say that they're quite cohesive. There's an association called the Chiney Association of Greater Toronto, and basically, you know, it's a social club, and so there are a lot of Jamaicans, and there's also the Caribbean Chinese Association, so a lot of Chinese Jamaicans belong to that association.
Let me ask you, if I asked you or someone else from the community, you know, how you identify yourself, what do you say now? Do you say I'm, you know, my heritage is Jamaican? Do you say Chinese Jamaican?
Always Jamaican Chinese.
Jamaican Chinese.
Yes, but of course I feel very Canadian as well. I've lived most of my life here and love it here. So when I'm outside of Canada, obviously I'll say, you know, I'm Canadian.
Right.
But I was born in Jamaica.
But people obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, I think most people would say to you when you say the word Jamaican, they must say to you, well, you don't look very Jamaican.
They say that all the time.
All the time. Okay. Which is interesting because your documentary is really a story of people who feel attached to an ethnicity, but they don't look like, or what our perception of someone from a certain place should look like, that. So, and this seems to be becoming more common in film and literature. There's Chiney Girl, which is a documentary about a woman in Trinidad who's of Chinese heritage. Why do you think we're seeing more of this kind of story nowadays?
I think that our history, our history is evolving, and as we sort of, there are so many societies where we come from different places, and so, you know, you think about Canada and how many different, you know, communities there are here, and so, you know, in the next couple of generations, children here, you know, who are from Somalia, let's say, will talk about being, you know, Somali Canadian, right? And their families will integrate here, and you know, then it becomes, you know, this is, Canada will be part of their story. So I think that's happened to a lot of us, that, you know, we move around, and so then we adopt these societies, but we change them and we impact them, and we want to have that validated, and we want to tell those stories, because it's, you know, I partially wanted to do this film, not for myself, but, you know, I have, my nephew has children, and I want it for their children's children, you know, people that I'll never meet, but then it's like, you know, this is where, you know,
we came from.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's just such a primal kind of need for us to tell our stories.
You are Canadian and live here, but you grew up in a Chinese shop in Jamaica. It certainly seems to me you still have a strong attachment to Jamaica.
Definitely. I mean, it's a place that occupies my imagination. You know, as a child, we always have fondness, right, for what we grew up with, right? And so I just wanted to explore this because it is kind of a period that hasn't been recorded. I mean, there have been, you know, some scholars who've written on it, and there are some people in the community who've written excellent books, you know, about the Chinese Jamaican experience. But it's, you know, film is what I do, and so I wanted to do it on film.
Okay, aside from the weather, what do you miss most about Jamaica?
Oh, the food.
Lots of good Jamaican food in Toronto, at least.
For sure. But what I do miss, if I'm going to be specific, I miss the fruits. You know, there's nothing like getting a mango that's been sun-ripened off of a tree, and you pick it, and the sweetness can't be, you know, you can't compare it. So I do miss the fruits.
Okay, Jeanette Kong, thank you for our conversation today and for your documentary. It's an interesting insight into a community I knew very little about in Jamaica. Thank you.
Thank you, Pia.
And thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Here's a preview of what's coming up on our program on Monday. We'll see you then.
My wife's got it right. We're sleepwalking here. We're really sleepwalking. So this is not just a global economic crisis. This is a species crisis. There is no guarantee we will remain here. 99.5% of all the species that have ever been on this little planet have come and gone. I think the next century is a defining moment for our species.
Funding for the agenda in the summer with Pia Chattopadhyay is provided by Ontario's 33,000 chartered accountants, public policy leaders since 1879. More information is available at icao.on.ca. And by contributions to TVO by viewers like you. Thank you. Welcome to the world of awesome, where the incredible is a daily occurrence, and beauty is found in the most unexpected places. Experience the moments, ones that make you smile, ones that open your mind, and ones that take your breath away. Weeknights at 7 on TVO.
Hey everyone, I'm Tyler, and this is my younger brother Alex, and we're the hosts and filmmakers behind TVO's original documentary series, The Water Brothers.
And we've been watching TVO since we were really young guys.
Yeah, when I was actually taller than him.
I like the nature programs, and Tyler loved Polka Dot Door.
Well, I love the films too, and now you can watch TVO's programs online whenever it's convenient for you.
And we still watch TVO. TVO's tagline says, "Makes you think." And it does.
We're huge supporters of TVO, and we'll hope you'll consider becoming one too.
Go online or call the number below and become a TVO supporter today.
Hey guys, what's with the construction hats?
Isn't this TVOparents.com?
Yeah, we heard there's a toolkit here.
Well, yes, we've got parenting tools, tips, and videos geared to help kids become better learners.
Well, I want to be the best student I can be.
Visit TVOparents.com.
TVO.org. TVO to go 24/7.
Beyond the myths and legends of this rugged landscape lies the real history of a kingdom. A history of battles, political intrigue, and religious conflict that would change the shape and the destiny of Britain forever. The History of Scotland. Monday at 10 on TVO. Behold the primal beauty of geologic history.
Millions of years ago, this whole area was under the sea.
Ferocious volcanic blasts.
The division was so abrupt, you could say that's the morning the Ice Age ended.
Cities built upon ancient mile-wide slabs of ice.
How long do you think this whole event would have taken?
Oh, tens of millions of years.
The intergalactic voyage of our most precious metal. Birth of Britain, Tuesday at 9 p.m. on TVO.
In a place where women have no voice, one woman stood up to fight for the victimized. She brings hope. Wrapped in a pink sari. Pink saris, Wednesday at 9 on TVO.
Drugs make you very paranoid.
His mind was in chaos. He couldn't live in his skin. You know, drugs affect your mental thinking. It affects your memory. It was like living with Jekyll and Hyde.
Oh, come on!
I'm appalled. I can't believe you're doing this.
Love my family. I'm sorry. And I hope to God you look at these videos. You see what kind of mess I got myself into.
Ben, Diary of a Heroin Addict, September 12th on TVO.